of motifs that we'll be looking at are large snowflakes. They are constructed on a shape that is drafted from a ring of 6 hexagon shapes on a Paris ground graph paper. If I were to draw in the draft paper, you'll see these 6 hexagons form a ring, and you can plot a snowflake in that shape. On your worksheet, I've already blocked out the shapes in which the snowflakes will fit. The first variation is a familiar one and a very popular one, although its thread movements are not often applied in more complex shapes. It is still a good, useful one to know and to be able to use it as a ground in of itself. Like before, plot in the incoming and the outgoing pairs first, so that you know what you have available to make the shape with, where they come in and where they need to go out again. The pen markings are roughly in the middle of each of the hexagons of the graph paper. And in more complex shapes, when you need more space, you can move these pins right up to the corners too, corners and edges too. This snowflake starts with the topmost pairs, making a stitch. Then you bring in a pair on each side, and they make stitches with the adjacent pairs on the inside. Then the inside pairs make a stitch. You bring in a new pair on either side, making a stitch with the outside pairs. Then you have 2 inside pairs that make a stitch. The outside pairs make a stitch, and the furthest one gets thrown out. The inside pairs cross, outside pairs, inside pairs. And that is the first motif. Topmost incoming pairs, they make a stitch. You bring in a pair on each side at the top, inside, outside, inside, 2 pairs on the inside, outside, inside, outside, outsides, inside. When you have completed the guided exercises, try a couple on your own. Just in case, plot them out with pencil first. Inside topmost pairs, oh, forgot the pen markings. They become a conceptual anchor too, so when you see a pin, you know that the pairs adjacent to that pin, they need to do something. Bring in a pair from the outside, inside pairs cross. Bring in another pair from the outside, and now the inside two pairs, they make a stitch. The outside pairs make a stitch, one gets thrown out, the inside pairs cross, the outside pairs make a stitch, one pair from each gets thrown out, and finally the inside pairs cross. Practicing these stitches in this way, step by step, as if you're making it on the pillow, serves a dual purpose. Again, it makes you familiar with reasoning out how to fill up a shape, and also gives you practice on how to do it on the pillow. Figuring out the movement of the threads in this way allows you to be able to reason out more complex shapes later on. So please practice this well. The second large snowflake motif that we are going to practice now, this variation is the perfect summary of 4-pair clothwork, in that the principles applied in the thread movements of this snowflake can be applied to any large shape drafted on a Barris ground graph paper. So please practice this large snowflake variation very well. And I think you're starting to get the hang of it now, that we start first by indicating the incoming pairs and the exiting pairs. I keep on forgetting the final one. And then the pin markings. One pin for every 2 pairs. And just to make things interesting, this shape begins with an exception. The very first weaver is not an activated weaver passive combo around the first pin at the top. You just use the pair coming above the pin on either side of the shape to become the first weaver. And that weaver weaves through all the incoming pairs, including the furthest one coming in nearly horizontally. And then it gets abandoned. Then you make a new weaver around this pin. First, the passive and the weaver combo, and the weaver weaves through all the passives, and then it gets abandoned. Then you bring in the second pair from the first pin at the top as a new weaver. The weaver weaves through all the passives, including that edge one, which acts as a contour pair because it outlines the contour of the shape. The second weaver does the same but on the other side, and it exits. Now it's time to start throwing out pairs. So the weaver direction was to the right, and then so it needs to then be followed by a weaver moving towards the left. So the second last weaver is this contour pair. It gets thrown out, and the final weaver is the other contour pair. Let's just repeat that again. This motif starts with an exception, the two pairs surrounding the first pin where you want to create a weaver from is not activated like at the first, the small snowflakes with a passive weaver combo, but you just start with a pair at the top of the pin and create a weaver that weaves through all the incoming pairs, including the furthest one. Then you make a new weaver from the pairs surrounding that pin, one passive, weaver. The weaver weaves through all and gets abandoned as a passive. The last thread to enter the shape becomes a weaver by default. It weaves through all the passives, gets abandoned. Now you've run out of pairs that enter the shape. You need to start throwing pairs out, but there's only space enough for two more weavers. And in that case, you start throwing out the contour pairs. First, the one right on the edge, and then the second one at the furthest edge on the opposite side. And like before, practice drawing the shape as if you are making it on the pillow, stitch by stitch. That way you'd be able to, once you have internalized the technique of the thread movements, you'd be able to apply this to more complex shapes and compound shapes. Let's just do one example without a guide. Technically, this motif can be started on either side, so you can either create a weaver from that pair or from that pair. And remember, the first weaver that you create breaks the rule that you create a weaver and a passive combos from all the incoming pairs. So instead, just to fill up the shape, right at the top, the first available pair on the diagonal. These two act as, that corner acts as a straight line. You create a weaver that weaves through all the pairs, including the furthest one surrounding that pin. And then that weaver becomes a passive. You create a new weaver, and here the usual rule applies: a passive and a weaver combo around a pin. The pair at the top of the pin becomes a passive, the pair below the pin becomes the new weaver. The weaver weaves through all the pairs and it gets abandoned. The final pair becomes a new weaver by default. And then we can make start throwing out pairs. There's only enough room for 2 more weavers, so let's use the very first weaver that we created as the second last pair to weaver to throw out. And then the second weaver that we created as the last weaver to throw out. And then you can tidy it up. Once you've reasoned it out, I think this motif is the most important motif of this workshop, so please practice this one really well until it becomes almost automatic. Once your worksheet 1 is completed like this, congratulations, that's half the battle won. You can move on to the next lesson and the next worksheet.